Management Plans Work Group Agricultural Subgroup meeting. We do have a webinar going today, so for those of you in the room, I would again encourage you to move up to the table if you think you'll have anything you'd like to say. We'd like everyone to be speaking into microphones as they have comments so that the people on the webinar can hear whoever is speaking. We are also recording this meeting. For those of you in the back, if you do have something to say, you're welcome to either move up to the table or we do have a handheld microphone in the back. If you decide you would like to say something, please just raise your hand and someone will bring you that microphone. So my name is Natalie Mast. I am the manager for the Management Plans group here at ADWR. And today we are, going to be focusing largely on the type of data that we have available related to the agricultural conservation programs. So we're going to be walking through some of that data, but we really do want to have a conversation and start to hear from some of you all regarding how should we best look at this data? How do we understand this data in the context of these conservation programs and in the context of moving these conservation programs forward into the next management plan? So these meetings are open to the public, open to anyone who would like to participate. Again, we are really hoping to draw on some of your expertise and to hear some of your ideas on whether the conservation programs that are existing are the correct ones, whether they're structured in the correct way, or whether there's something totally new that we could come up with regards to these conservation programs. For a little bit of background I'm going to go ahead and turn off the lights. Sorry if you can't see that. Sorry about that. So for a little bit of background, in case any of you might have missed the first management plan work group meetings, the statute that we're working under here indicates that we should create a management plan for each active management area for each of 5 management periods. And that the conservation programs in these management plans should be designed to reduce withdrawals of groundwater. We are, in this group, working on the 5th management plan. And again, we're hoping to obtain feedback, obtain some stakeholder involvement regarding the development of those management plans. We are kind of at the beginning of this process, and our first step as a part of this group is to assess the existing conservation programs. So again, how do we use the data to better understand these existing programs, and how do we determine whether those programs have been effective? So you can see on the screen here a timeline for a little bit of clarification. We have heard some questions both about pace and regarding the timeline, so we did want to address those. The ADWR has a goal of adopting the remaining 4th management plans in the next 2 years. Kind of concurrently with that, we have formed this management plans work group to begin the development and the stakeholder outreach related to the 5th management plans. So we anticipate that this development, research, outreach process is going to be a long one. It's going to be, we're not intending to start drafting the 5th management plans until after those remaining 4th management plans are adopted. Okay, so with that, I will hand you off to Saba Asefa. Saba is our agricultural planner here at ADWR, and she will walk you through some of the conservation program information.
All right, hello everyone. Like Natalie said, my name is Saba, and I'm the agricultural planner here in the AMAs. Thank you for coming out. So I'm just going to go over some background information on the conservation program. So the whole point of this meeting is to find ways to reduce withdrawals of groundwater. And so in these subgroup meetings, we'd like to find ways to work towards this goal. And so we have some statutory requirements that we still have to stick to, like calculating the water duty and having the BMP program, but we do have some leeway within the statute that we can work with to try to do some new things that we think will help. And so within this conservation program, we have a base program, we have the historic cropping program, and we have the best management practices program. And so we also will be doing progress reports at least every 3 years, and this will help, and it'll be public, so that'll help with the transparency of the data. So I'm just going to go into what each program consists of. So we have the base program, and the components are the water duty acres, and then those are all calculated out. A lot of it's based on what acreage we had, irrigation acreage we had in 1975 to 1979. And then it's in statute, as you can see here highlighted. The director may adjust the highest 25% of the final irrigation water duties established within an area of similar farming conditions. So this is something that we may look at. It's not something that you have to do. And so looking at the fourth management plan, they did a study to see how much reduction would happen. And basically in the Phoenix AMA, it would only be 11% of the highest water duties would be adjusted. Pinal only 11%, and then Santa Cruz wouldn't even have to be adjusted because it's not in the top 25% of water duty. The other program that we have is the BMP, and basically in statute, it's there to achieve conservation that's at least equal to what's required under the base program. There's a lot of room to change things within it, so we want to hear what you guys have to say about ideas you have about that, as long as it's equivalent to what we can do in the base program. And we have over 100,000 irrigation acres enrolled currently in the base management practices program. And so these are just some of the things that we have to try to stick to. So you must implement and report on practices annually. There's no annual allotment to adhere to, but you still have to follow the program requirements. And so there's been some proposed provisions for the 4MP, and so we can talk about those, and we can see if we want to keep those in the 5MP or if we want to adjust those how we want. And then there was a study done with our data to see if we could compare how conservation works with the base program versus the BMP program. We know it's limited data, so we could probably do better with more data if we could find that data. But this is kind of what we found with that study. And so in the total AMAs, if you look at percent total irrigation acres in the BMP versus percent of total ag water use, it seems like it's not equivalent to how much conservation we can have in the base program. So we just want to see how we can improve that. Some other programs we have are the historic cropping program. Currently, no one's enrolled in it, but it is in statute. And then there's requirements for districts, like lining their canals and limiting how much lost water they report or how much lost water they have. So that's kind of a brief overview of the conservation program for agriculture. Does anyone have questions on that so far? All right. Well, I'll turn it over back to Natalie. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Saba. Okay, so next we're going to cover a little bit of the historic data that we do have. What you're going to see on the screen in the next couple slides is kind of examples of the ways we have typically looked at the data in the past. What we are hoping to have a conversation about today with you and kind of going forward in this group is what are the other ways we can or should be looking at this data? What are the ways this data should be further broken down to better understand the different conservation programs? And are there ways that we could look at this data to better understand what other programs we might develop for the future for moving into the 5th management plan? So the basic structure of ADWR's reporting requirements was covered in the August 20th meeting, but I'm going to review a little bit of that here again today. What you see up on the screen is kind of an overview of general reporting requirements within the AMAs. And then each conservation program has additional specific reporting requirements. So when we talk about reported data, we are largely referring to data from these AMA annual reports, under which users with non-exempt wells, which are greater than 35 gallons per minute, must meter their pumping, and those who are subject to the reporting requirements must file annual reports with ADWR. Those annual reports do contain a broad range of information, but largely the focus of that information is looking at volumes of water received and delivered, the types of water, how that water is used. Whoops, and to go back, sorry, let me back up just a little bit. So in addition to the reporting requirements that we mentioned here, in addition to the existing reporting requirements, ADWR does have the ability to require additional things. So that can also be part of the conversation here is there data we're missing? Are there additional requirements that we should be, is there additional information that we should be asking for with those annual reports? Yeah, so that can be a part of this conversation and in our discussions in moving these conservation programs forward. So with regards to who is required to report, each owner of an irrigation grandfathered right is required to submit an annual report to the department unless that IGFR is smaller than 10 acres, in which case they are exempt. If they are in the BMP program, sometimes several IGFR rights might be grouped into one BMP, and then in that case they would only submit one report associated with that BMP farm unit. Additionally, some irrigation districts take responsibility to file on behalf of their right holders within the district, so the individual reports in that case don't need to be submitted. All of this data is compiled annually, and as I mentioned earlier, a lot of this can be broken out by water type, by AMA, and to some extent it can be broken down by user category or other things. So what you can see here is, again, kind of an example of one of the ways we've looked at this information in the past. So this is annual report data aggregated by AMA. So each of the colors here, sorry, those are a little bit hard to see. Each of the colors here are a different AMA. So you have Phoenix, Pinell, Prescott is a little bit hard to see. It's a small one there. Santa Cruz is in yellow, also a small one, and then the Tucson AMA on top. So what you're seeing is total water use over time by AMA. So in this kind of comparison, you can see that some AMAs, Phoenix, for example, have reduced their agricultural water use over time, where some other AMAs have stayed relatively steady or increased that agricultural water use. This particular breakdown, again, kind of an example of how we might have looked at this in the past, is total annual water use by source of water. So we have groundwater, CAP, surface water, yellow is effluent, and then the blue is spill, and in some places you can see just a little bit of green, which is other water, which is typically some kind of surface water under our categories. So again, this is kind of an example of how you can see water sources changing over time. What you might be able to see here is, for example, you see that the CAP water use has increased over time, and we know that going forward we might expect that volume, that trend to change. Yeah, so there's things that you can start to see within the trends of the way we've typically broke down this data. What we will want to consider, and again further discuss both today and as we move forward in this group, is how do we look at these types of data to further break them down? How do we use this data to understand how we might adjust these programs to move this into the 5th management plan? So again, this management plan work group is a stakeholder forum for all of you. We really are hoping to gain some insight from all of you. You all are the people on the ground, the people who live and breathe this. You will forever know more about agriculture than I ever could hope to. So we really hope to, through this process, learn from you, gain feedback, see what it is that you hope for through this process in these conservation programs. Under these guiding principles, we know what the statutes say. We know that the conservations are supposed to be designed to reduce withdrawals of groundwater. So what is it that we can find that fits within that framework that will move us into the 5th management plan and beyond? So I'd like to open it up to the audience at this point. I know we don't have that many people around the table, so hopefully you all might have some thoughts and input. But maybe some things to think about as we start a little bit of discussion here is, what are the ways that we can look at this data to better understand the conservation programs? I know the ways we've looked at it in the past have their flaws, so let's consider how we can adjust that analysis to better understand these programs. Are there additional sources of data that we should be leaning on rather than just the AMA annual reported data? We would love to hear from you all about those things and any other thoughts that you all might have. So go ahead.
So earlier in the presentation, you talked about the BMPs and comparing the water use with the base program, whether they were actually seeing conservation. I think there's a difference when you're talking about conservation based on withdrawals, total withdrawals in the AMA, and the amount of acre feet used on each acre. You may find, if you go out down in the Pinal County or something, that the guys who are in this BMP program may be using more acre feet on less acres. So that those farming practices are more productive, and you have more of the water going to the plant, and they can produce the same amount of crop on less land. So maybe in the long run, they're actually using less water. You're actually withdrawing less water, in other words, not using less on each acre. But I don't think that that's a one-to-one calculation to determine how each different program affects total groundwater withdrawals if you had a bunch of participation in BMPs.
Sure. If I can back up for just 1 second, as you're making comments, we do have people participating via webinar, so if you would just state your name before you start your comment.
I'm Dan Jones. I represent a bunch of irrigation districts and farmers in all three, Tucson, Phoenix, and Pinal AMA.
Thank you. And we do appreciate that comment. We do know that that is kind of a data gap that we've had where we only have irrigation acres, the legally irrigable acres in our database, rather than the actual acres that might have been irrigated associated with that right in a given year. So that's something we would like to consider, learn more about, see if there's additional data that we can find with regards to that. Yes. Mr. Betcher.
Brian Betcher, Maricopa Stanfield, and just to tag on with what Dan said, is related to the base program. I think we're finding in our district, and we haven't done a study of it yet, but a lot of the IGFRs that are still under the base program may be marginal lands that aren't farmed as intensively because they've consolidated their best farm ground with limited water with their BMPs. So you've got to add that into the mix, and I think you had a bullet point in there about looking at what's actually being irrigated. So you've got to drill down into what's happening on the base to get a better comparison, because right now I would say you've got an apples to oranges comparison.
Great. So maybe something to follow up on that is, are there places that we could obtain that sort of data in order to drill down on that? So within our databases, like I said, we only have the irrigation acres. Are there entities that might voluntarily supply that information? Are there public information sources that we might be able to get that information from? I guess from our perspective, it's been difficult in the past for us to actually do those analyses because we don't have access to that information at this time.
This is Dan Jones again. So there are a lot of this information as far as, I assume you're getting at what land is irrigated in a given year. I don't know, so there's a difference between, are you looking for like the number of acres or which specific pieces of ground? There's a different thing. I think that the districts have a pretty good idea how much land is being farmed in a given year, and they track their water deliveries and their pumping and everything very closely. As far as going out on a GIS map and saying that this specific 12 acres on this area is farmed, that's a different thing. I don't know that districts are prepared at this time to be able to produce that, just because they don't keep track of that necessarily. Some of this information you can get from USDA. The farmers have to report some of their stuff every year. So there are other people who have it, but I don't know that the districts do. In a lot of cases, they're the ones filing the annual reports.
Okay. So I think in terms of analyzing the program, it would have to be more location-based, right? Because we'd have to be able to correlate the location of irrigation with whether that particular location is under a BMP or the base program in order to be able to compare the two programs, right?
Well, that could be within, if you enroll several IGFRs into it, I may not farm my entire IGFR. I might have, let's say I have a 3,200 acre foot IGFR and I farm 2,800 acres in a given year and I rotate different lands. The districts aren't always driving around and seeing which part of that IGFR is not farmed at any time.
Okay. But what you're saying is we would be able to say maybe 10 acres of this IGFR were farmed, 10 acres of this BMP were farmed. We would still be able to potentially break it down by which program they're in. Okay.
The total number, I think, is an easier thing to track.
Okay. Okay. Are there any other slides that I can go back to? Did anybody else have any other thoughts or questions with regards to the type of data we have, the way we have looked at this data in the past?
This is Ron Rayner. Do have a question about, for data. One of the, a key element of the base program was knowing the crop history, and then you use the Leonard Erie numbers from back in the 1950s, may have been late 40s even, that he developed over here to the Water Research Center off of Broadway. And, we were making about 2.5 tons of wheat or barley back then, and we were making 1,100 pounds of cotton. And now we're expected to make, 3.5 tons of wheat and 3 bales or 1,500 pounds of cotton off of that same amount of water. One of the things that I hadn't reviewed that list of the crops and what the consumptive use numbers were, those consumptive use numbers that were developed by Erie. I'm not sure that they fit in today's crops. I mean, you don't get that additional yield for nothing. I mean, it takes nutrients out of the ground. It takes additional water to make it. And the other thing that I am concerned about is that when you look at some of the recent news articles about the warming climate, and everybody's worried about drought in the future, but one of the things that's a direct result of warming is a higher evapotranspiration rate. So one of the things that I'm fearful of is if we kept everything exactly the same, we may be going backwards as the user of that water. So it does concern me. Where do we go with this? I know even for the fourth management plan, that idea of reducing those top water duties, cutting them back by 10%, one of the things that would need to be done was that you need to look at, what's the history of on that farm? Were they still using it all? And maybe there's a reason. Don't just, cut it down just because you started off with a higher number. There was a reason you started with a higher number, because you had to document it. But if you just arbitrarily cut it, it could be devastating to somebody. But anyway, some of the information that would be interesting to see is how do we compare under today's cropping patterns. I mean, we may be, how many years is that? 70 years from when that initial information was developed. And there were a few crops on there that I could tell were guessed at, because Leonard Erie did not test every crop. He only did a handful, and the others were estimated, and some of them look a little wacky. I think the sorghum number was the same as wheat, and sorghum's a summer crop and wheat's a winter crop, so I can't imagine that. I can't grow sorghum for as much water, with as much water as we grow wheat with, so it does take more. Anyway, there were a few things that I noticed in looking through those numbers. I didn't bring them with me to go through the exact ones, but that's something that needs to be looked at.
Okay, great. So consumptive use is definitely something that we have talked internally about looking into updating associated with the fifth management plan. We have reached out to a number of entities looking for resources regarding new numbers on this, and have so far largely come up empty in finding updated consumptive use type numbers. So that's also something we would love to hear more information about. That's something that we are very much open to in terms of updating those consumptive use numbers if there's new research out there that we have so far failed to find. So. Anyone else? Are there any other slides or any questions on this data that I can go back to?
This is Brian again. Having been involved in the development of the BMPs along the way, one of the things I thought that was helpful about that development, it was looking at the science of the elements that ended up being in the checklists that growers would have to qualify for, and the recognition through what maybe the Cooperative Extension Service has done, what U of A might have done to say, if you do this practice, you will save water, or you will help soil health. You will do all of the things, and by adopting all of these things, we know if you do all of these things, you will use your water more wisely. And it removed the need for people to report data, which is time-consuming. It can be cumbersome. It can be a level of things that they're just trying to make a living. But if you can, whatever you do, if you can keep it on that level, then you create buy-in without a bunch of extra reporting. Okay. It was successful then, it seems to me, and I think it still is now. I think the other thing, I think Dan was hinting at this too, and Ron as well, is are you measuring conservation by unit of production for unit of water use? You could use the same amount of water or more and be substantially increasing your production. There is a need for production, not just saving water. You got to balance both together.
Sure, and I do think there is possibly some differences between the differences in the way that conservation has been defined in the past. There are many different ways to look at that, and perhaps that's a part of this conversation, kind of redetermining how it is that we look at conservation, how we determine conservation and equivalency in the context of these programs. I think we can be open to those conversations.
Stan Jones. So I do have another question about sort of your last slide that we looked at with the potential analyses stuff. I guess other than the acre feet and acre use on active irrigated acres, which that kind of goes back to the thing I was talking about initially. As far as a number, a raw number of how many acres, I think that's something possibly that wouldn't be that difficult to figure out. But I'm not sure I understand what we're looking at as far as changes in water use patterns. What is DWR trying to understand, or what information are you looking to, or are you looking for us to offer up some things, the way that farmers use water differently once they start doing these BMP activities?
So I think it's a little bit of both. We are certainly hoping for insight from these stakeholders in the way that you look at your water use. We would definitely like to hear about that, because we very often hear that the way that we look at it is incorrect. So we want to try to adjust those things and better understand the way that you all look at your water use, and help us understand the ways that we can conserve within the ways that you look at water use. But also, the way we need to look at this is because the statutes lay out that these conservation programs should be designed to be equivalent and should be designed to reduce withdrawals of groundwater. We also need to kind of assess these programs in that context and see if they are effective by those measures. So we kind of need to be able to see those water use trends over time and also compare the two programs to each other. Are there any thoughts on, so besides what we have up on the screen as kind of examples for potential analyses, and maybe apart from the things we've already touched on, are there any additional analyses that we should be considering? Are there ways to better understand the data we might have access to in the context of these programs, in the context of moving these programs into the future?
It's Ron Rayner. Seeing the one bullet point that's any data on irrigation method, I know in looking through all the different items you can choose off of the different sheets to enter into a best management practices program, it doesn't seem to allow anything as a benefit from switching over to, say, to flood irrigation. And it's kind of interesting because it seems like in the last few years, it seems like surface flood has received some kind of a negative connotation as being inefficient, when, it's a system that we rapidly have adopted for every acre on our farm, because every time we implement it, we gain water. And we're much more efficient in utilizing that system. And we do it a little differently now than we used to. We make the borders more narrow. Of course, they're all laser leveled. And we push it to the other end as rapidly as we can, and then you shut it off before it gets to the end, so you don't run water off of the field. It's way more efficient in the way we do it than we ever were with any type of furrow irrigation. Still not as efficient as drip, but we really picked up efficiency. And there's no way that I can express that on any of those applications, unless I just write up an addendum sheet to try to sway somebody's thinking about it.
So maybe what I'm hearing from you is that there could be some adjustment to the way those types of BMPs are written?
Yes, the way they're scored, absolutely. Okay.
Any other thoughts? Yeah.
My name is Michael Curtis. I work with a couple of irrigation.
Turn it on, Mike.
There you go. Button. There you go. My name is Michael Curtis. I work with a couple of irrigation districts. Knowing that you're here to help irrigated agriculture consistent with less pumping, what are your concerns that if we don't give you, you may end up with a wrong result? Have you studied, and do you have a list of items that if we're not able to give you may lead to the wrong result being concluded by your effort?
So correct me if I'm misunderstanding you. We are doing our own research. We are considering adjustments to these programs from other sources, things we've come across from other resources and in our own research. I think everything is on the table under this work group, but again, this is going to be kind of a long development process. I think there's going to be a lot of conversation and back and forth about how is it that we, under the framework we have, adjust these programs and move into the future, move into the fifth management plan with these programs.
I want to give you an example. Before 1980, a farmer implemented at a great expense some terrific conservation practices. Then the rules came out, and he bore a horrible adverse impact because he didn't get credit for that. If there had been a type of working process where someone has said, by the way, we're getting ready to develop these rules, if you're getting ready to do something that's really going to conserve a lot of water, but you want to not be harmed by the rules we are about to drop on you, why don't you consider the following things? Because if you don't consider them, or if you don't do this, if you don't give us this information, that we are very likely to drop a hammer on you and not make it economical for you to continue farming. You're a state agency that are, in this instance, you're not looking to adversely impact irrigated agriculture, but as you do your studies, you have a tendency to see things that could, unless you're given the right information, the right data, or the right concepts. I'm wondering whether or not you have or could create your own list of items your list of what I would call the BT, by the way items. By the way, farmers and irrigated agriculture in Pinal County, be sure you do A, B, C, D, and E. It might be helpful because we may not be aware of all of those things. That's my comment.
Okay, thank you. I would just say that our objective here, from the department's perspective, our objectives with any of these conservation programs is to, as the statute says, reduce withdrawals of groundwater. So the purpose of this outreach, the purpose of these types of stakeholder meetings and getting input from you all is so that we can develop those programs in a way that is not adversarial or punitive on the individuals. We're not trying to shut anybody down, but we do want to work within the framework of the law and better manage these water resources to the best of our ability. Sure.
Well, we have a $2 billion a year industry in Pinal County, and if we're heading towards a precipice that you don't hear any of us tell you we see that precipice, but you do see it, we would hope that you would volunteer to say, by the way, don't go there.
Natalie, this is Cheryl Sweeney. I think when I see the terminology of that these, if you implement a best management practices program, it should be equivalent to the base program and reduce groundwater withdrawals. I don't read that to mean the withdrawals themselves have to be equal. Under each program, you have a reduction in groundwater use because either the base program required it or you've implemented practices that have resulted in less groundwater use. The fact is that they may be cropping or growing entirely different crops now. And the best management program, I say, I don't think it has to be equal. I think equivalent gives that flexibility to allow the farmers to change their practices and to change with the market to stay viable.
This is Dan Jones. I agree with that completely, and I also think that applies to when you're looking at your graphs at your annual agricultural water use. That that same principle applies there. When you're looking at every year, depending on markets, people are using different amounts of water, depending on the water supply, if there's more or less CAP water available to offset groundwater use. As long as the water users are using less groundwater than they otherwise would have, that should be consistent with the intent of the groundwater code and the purpose of the management plan. So I think we should just be careful when you're looking at just strictly acre foot per acre use or overall volumes of water on an annual basis, that you're not getting, getting into a corner here where you think that, or we all think that we need to make sure that every year it looks like we're using less groundwater, because sometimes it will be less, sometimes it will be more, and it will change year to year.
Sure. So what I'm hearing is that you would be looking for some nuance in how we would evaluate that equivalency, I think. Understood. Mr. Betcher?
This is Brian Betcher again. Yeah, again, piggybacking on what Dan was saying. Trying to capture the effects of areas where you've had additional surface water supplies that have offset groundwater pumping in the past that are now shifting. I think that may need to be captured somewhere along the line. But one of the issues agriculture had in the very, very beginning with districts that were going to have multiple supplies is all of the water used went against the allotment. So it's not a true measure of your groundwater pumping. It's your water use against your allotment. If you're able to maximize surface water supplies, but you're overusing your allotment, and that results in better production and better economies, that's a good thing for everybody. And how to capture that in your data, I think it is somewhat important. And again, that's another nuance that I think needs to be evaluated along the way. I'm not sure exactly how you get there, but that understanding needs to happen. And, the major concern is for DWR in terms of groundwater, okay? And sometimes you focus on total water use, and sometimes there can be a disconnect.
So maybe to summarize how we might analyze that, it would be something along the lines of something along the lines of total use broken down by supply source rather than just looking at total use per acre or something along those lines. Maybe I'm not saying that elegantly.
Yeah, I think that could be the case.
Okay.
You may have a situation where you see what you might think is a spike and an increase in groundwater use, but your overall trend over time is downward. So you've got to capture those subtleties more on a long term as opposed to year to year.
Okay. Thank you.
Natalie, this is Ron Rayner again. In that chart that you had up earlier with the uses over time, I think you could pick out the wet years. There was where those dips were in the groundwater pumping. And see 93 up there, that was when we had the huge flows, and then a couple of others. And then in recent years, it flattened out pretty good because it was a tad dry. And the last 2 years are not on there. So it kind of shows how they go hand in hand. But something that'll pull that line down pretty fast in the Phoenix AMA, at least, we may have already met whatever goals you might have for reducing agriculture's use of water. That's going to be another question. Is on the lands that we farm, and these all happen to be leased lands, by the way. In the last 2 years, there were 900 acres that have gone out of agricultural production that have been, those are historic farm lands, and they were all in the Roosevelt Irrigation District, which relies on pumped water as their source of water. Even though it's a district, they do have some other little bit of effluent, I believe, but only about half of those acres had their final water use reported last year, and this coming March will be the report on the other half. So there's about 9 times 5, so there's about 4,500 acre feet already deducted off of ag's use, unfortunately.
Okay, so what I might hear there in terms of things we could analyze would be that it might be helpful for us to look at like acres of ag land converted, and especially those acres which are largely groundwater dependent, and maybe understand those a little bit differently. Okay.
Natalie, this is Jason Moyes. I have districts who are both in the Phoenix AMA, some that are not in any AMA, but also the Harquahala district that is in an INA. And I apologize if this is the wrong time to ask this question, but in looking through the materials from the first meeting, which I wasn't able to attend, and then missing the first part of this meeting today, I haven't been able to find anywhere that talks about what the proposed fourth management plan or the draft fifth management plan, what impacts those might have on the INA specifically. Can you answer that question?
Sure. So the management plans apply specifically to the active management areas. There is not a management plan for the INAs.
So other than the reporting requirements for the INA, there are no other proposed changes or regulations that these management plans will have on Harquahala.
That's correct.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions or comments?
This is Riley Stone. I appreciate a lot of the comments that have been made, a lot of the other participants. Would we have the opportunity, after we speak with clients, things to send in additional, perspectives inside the in other words, maybe a different way of looking at measuring for their concerns? Is that something we can add sort of to the record, so to speak, if we want to put that into consideration?
Sure. So any additional comments, any additional suggestions can come into us at any time. We have an email address set up that is probably the best way to submit those, and that email address is managementplans@azwater.gov. Okay. If we're ready to move to the next section of the meeting, we do want to have a little bit of conversation in addition to kind of this data conversation, which I very much thank you all for being interactive, for having these conversations with us. We would like to continue this conversation in future meetings, and we also want to get some feedback from the group regarding how do we structure these future meetings? What types of topics would you like to see? Is there additional information that you'd like to see from ADWR? How frequently would you all like to meet? What would be the target from you all for next dates for continuing these conversations, for continuing the meeting of the subgroup? Does anybody have any thoughts on So our general thought on how frequently these would meet would be probably that each subgroup would not meet more than once or twice in between the main work group meetings. Our next main work group is December 4th. So there could be an option to have an additional meeting before then if there was additional information that you all wanted to hear from us, or we could wait until after that meeting and allow a little more time for ADWR to do some analysis, for you all to get back to us with some additional data sources or ideas on what those analyses might look like. We're kind of open to the will of the group on this one. Any ideas?
Bass, I'm fine with, once or whatever between the main group meetings, as long as we don't come up to a main group meeting December 4th and we get handed 12 pages of BMPs and requirements and stuff that DWR wants us to have. We'd like to have those before that for a group meeting.
Sure.
If that is what occurs.
Sure. I think that's totally reasonable. So our intent would be that the types of things that this subgroup brings back to that main group would definitely be things that we had already discussed here. We do intend to kind of report back on the progress of each subgroup at that main group meeting, but we'll probably also have additional topics there. And it is also, maybe I can also clarify that it is our intent to work with you all to develop new BMPs, those sorts of things throughout this process. ADWR does not have a draft of the fifth management plans at this point. We aren't intending to start drafting that until after those fourth management plans are adopted. So we have lots of time for the development of these concepts, and we want to have you all help us consider what exactly those concepts should be, and maybe what the best BMPs, for example, might be to carry forward into the fifth management plan.
Michael Curtis, would you remind us again then of what you see as the drop-dead date for adoption of the fourth management plan?
So there are 3 remaining fourth management plans that...
Just one of irrigated agriculture.
So each active management area gets its own management plan. There are 3 active management areas that do not have a fourth management plan adopted yet. So Phoenix will be adopting Phoenix's first, then Pinal, then Santa Cruz. And we are intending to have all 3 of those adopted within the next 2 years.
That means before this date into 2021?
So within the next 2 years, basically for the fifth management plans, for the
fourth.
So it depends on which AMA you would be referring to with regards to...
But you said all 3 before the expiration of 2 years.
Right. So each management plan, we're going to be kind of doing them in sequence. So we'll start with the adoption process for the Phoenix fourth management plan, and then we'll do the legal adoption process for the Pinal, and then Santa Cruz.
That excites us most.
So
that's most exciting for most of us. Pinal would be what, 2020 or 2021?
We anticipate that we would be starting the promulgation process, the legal adoption process for that, sometime next year, probably summertime or so.
That's fun. That's very responsive. Thank you.
Basaha again. So, if I understand correct, so let's say we don't have another meeting before the next big group meeting. What you would report to them is this data analysis discussion. It wouldn't be the other items from, I think, 564 that say reducing irrigation duties, 567 which says let's build a conservation assistance program for farmers, or let's build a state program that you might retire, poor lands with purchase. So my understanding, right, it's not going to include these other things. It's just going to be, here's what we have talked about for data and analysis.
Right. So our initial step here is really getting a better grasp of the data that we do have and how we might analyze it, how we might better understand these conservation programs. And then in future meetings of this subgroup and of the work group, we'll get into kind of the more policy side of it, yes.
And this is Brian, and just to clarify, it sounds like you're headed more on a path of being able to do the analysis with the idea of incorporating them in the fifth management plan, not trying to put something in at the tail end of the work we've done on the fourth management plan.
Right, that's correct. Yes, this group is focused specifically on the fifth management plan. That's correct.
Have you, for your work on the fifth plan, data acquisition, does staff internally have any drop-dead goal dates that they would like to accomplish certain things by, or is that still a work in process? And you've indicated whether or not we have more meetings or fewer meetings. I think depending upon how you're attaining some of your internal goals and objectives, boss, is that what you mean by getting reports? So if you have a PERT chart, or excuse me, maybe they don't use those words anymore, but a critical path chart for what you have internally, goals and objectives, that might help us to advise you as to whether we think it'd be nice to have a meeting.
Sure. So our general goal as a response to this meeting would be that we will kind of work through the items that we've discussed in this meeting and see, are there items that we can start doing this analysis right now, or are there items that we need additional data for, and maybe we'd be reaching back out to the group to see if there are additional data sources that any of you all know of that we might be able to look into. So I think the first step would be for us to start some of those data analyses, but I don't at this point have a timeline or anything like that associated with how long that all would take, largely because we wanted to go into this meeting keeping it kind of open-ended and being willing to hear input on what those analyses should be.
With the exception of Ron Rayner, I would like to, who I know would like to see the fifth management plan be adopted. It would be a terrific reward to me at my age if I could see it be adopted on time.
Great. So kind of in the absence of other thoughts, what I would propose is that we will have some discussions internally about maybe timelines for the types of data analysis that have been proposed today. We'll dig into a little bit, and we will send an email back out to the group with some thoughts regarding a next meeting date and a tentative date for that. Sure.
Leslie Hine. Okay.
Try a different one.
Hi, Leslie Hine, and I work with the environmental NGO world. Just one question process-wise. To your point in what you just said, if you are getting input and ideas and feedback through email, will you also incorporate some way to be sharing that? And how does the broader group present here see how things evolve outside of this forum?
That's a great question. So something we've talked about but maybe don't have a fully formed concept around is how do we do some kind of data sharing associated with this group so that people outside of ADWR can do some of these analyses alongside us. I don't have a fully formed concept around that. I don't have a good answer to that at this point, but it's if there are ideas on how that might be managed, we're certainly open to that sort of participatory communication. Yeah. Okay. So I think we'll go ahead and close out. We do appreciate you all being here today. We really appreciate your participation and your feedback throughout this process. This presentation is already up on our website, and we will be sending out a follow-up email regarding additional future dates. Thank you all for your time.